It's Friday again, and that means the 49th edition of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. And I'm John Zogby. I'm a pollster, and I'm here with my son Jeremy, a pollster, and we're related. And we take topics in the news and discuss maybe broader implications, often from two different points of view, but respectfully so. And so, how are you this week?
I'm very well, and it's not the first time this has dawned on me, but it's really, I'm coming to realize it more and more that this program that we have, there's nothing else like it in the history of programs. I mean, radio, television, podcasts, where else is a father and a son get together and talk about the world? The closest thing I can think of maybe is Sanford and Son.
Sanford and Son. Elizabeth, this is the big one. I'll be Fred Sanford.
So you're Fred Sanford, but when you were younger, you looked like Lamont.
I did look
a Middle Eastern version of Lamont.
Nope, so. I did. Yeah, let's see what happens. Of course, Fred Sanford was redheaded.
Yeah?
Yeah. Wow.
So what's on your mind today?
So, tearing us apart and putting us back together again. Two themes I think that are important. I'll just mention the putting us back together again. We're bringing back and writing more now about the work we've done over the past decade on tribes, neo-tribes, and how they are defined uniquely in American society, but most importantly, how this methodology can be utilized by political strategists and marketing strategists and a whole host of other institutions and agencies to bring us closer together on shared values and shared aspirations. And we'll get to that, the putting us back together part. But what I want to ask you about is all the factors that exist out there that are tearing us apart. Mm-hmm. And there is indeed more talk about cultural splits, about tribalism, and importantly for us to consider the notion of secession. Mm-hmm. Rush Limbaugh was on, so this is Friday. Yesterday I heard some of it and read most of it, talking about how we're at a moment where Republicans and those with shared, let's call them traditional values for an older America, may very well be ready to split. How serious is it?
Well, if I understand, Rush Limbaugh has about 20 million
he did
listeners.
At one time. He could still, yeah.
And so I read that transcript. That was headline number one on Drudge yesterday. Mm-hmm. And they have a portion of his podcast. And a caller calls in and talks about how do we win. And he says, well, I thought you meant the culture war. And then goes on and brings up secession, bad marriage, maybe a bad marriage leads to a breakup. How much longer can we go on something has got to give? We've talked about that sentiment. In fact, we've been tracking it for years, but especially since May, we've really focused on that in the intelligence here. A show with 20 million listeners and that topic being brought up tells me the potential of an idea to go viral. So you talked about this concept that you developed 10 years ago and that we've really been actively trying to develop. And just to infuse some of my background in world history, here's how I imagine a scenario of tribes, right? Over 10,000 years ago. Tribes, by the way, is the vast majority of the human experience. Mm-hmm. Modern human is just a blip on the radar, but tribes are really based on kinship. 30 to 60 members in a tribe based on extended family, a bloodline. And this is when humankind, were highly mobile, had to move around in order to survive, and there were hunting grounds. And on any given day, one tribe and another tribe could come into contact and fight over the hunting grounds and the limited resources. And so there was the choice of either warring, or there was the choice of the two coming together. So the leaders on both sides could meet, and they could maybe display what their dance, their tribal dance was like, some of the figures and the objects that they revere, and just get a sense of what that other tribe was like. And could they forge an alliance based on similarities and shared values, or did they have to go to war with each other because of focusing on the dislikes? And that has been much of our history. And so here we are, modern humankind, and we're not really different. And so I just wanted to lay that broad notion of what it means to be tribal. But amazingly, tribal societies still can forge those alliances and come together based on shared values. The question is can we in the 21st century? Well, I don't see any reason why we can't. And I can talk about some examples of how that could look like, but why don't you offer some of your thoughts?
So the notion of tribes and cultural differences, regional differences, is not new. We fought a civil war over it, but I'm thinking of the Washington Post reporter Joel something or other, who wrote the book The Nine Nations of North America years ago, and just a whole new look at who we are, and essentially there were no borders in North America. So some tribes, based on being French, were parts of Maine and New Hampshire all the way up into Quebec. And then there was the Hispanic-based tribe that was down southwest and into Mexico. Then years later, maybe about 10 or a dozen years later, Woodward wrote a book about the 10 or 11 cultures of North America, and went into great detail, very powerful book about really some shared history, but completely different histories of, the Scotch-Irish-based South, for example, the ethnically developed, mercantile developed Middle Atlantic, and so on. But two things are at work here. One is our tribes are based on values and aspirations, and less on cultural habits, certainly less on demographics and on race. And we have found that being a member of one of our so-called tribes, work that we did for Ogilvy Mather and the other ad agency in Chicago that worked with us, the tribal membership and self-identification that people have of being in a tribe could be more persuasive as drivers of their decisions than race or ethnicity. The other thing is that America was not born as an ethnicity or as a culture. It was born as an idea. It was born as a political idea, a continental idea, a shared land, and around that, Founding Fathers developed institutions to serve a burgeoning, growing national community. Even when some were not members in their minds of being a national community, this was forged and has been developed and worked out over the decades and now over the centuries. And that national community is a threat. And I, for one, take that very, very seriously, because that's a threat to the American idea.
Yeah, and like you pointed out, this idea that we have with tribes, it's based on behavior, consumer habits, what people aspire to be, but also politics as well.
Yep.
But the importance is, as you alluded to, is to move beyond demographics. That so ingrained in our society is the notion of race and political affiliation, age, gender, and while all of that is important, right? The reality is that in the digital age, that's kind of meaning less and less. And the example that I would point to is, I didn't grow up in the 60s, obviously, but I've read a lot about the 60s and I've heard about it from you. But I'm convinced that in the 60s, if you took a girl of African-American background, maybe, college age from Alabama, and then you sent her to Minnesota to meet with a white male in his 40s, they probably would have nothing in common. But in today's environment, you take that same case study, they could love the same musicians. Absolutely. They could be buying from the same stores. They could have a lot more. Now, you could say that's shallow, but I don't think so, because that didn't exist decades ago. Now there's such crossover that we need to rethink how we segment people. And
that's a good point.
There are really the possibilities are limitless of how this crossover can take place. And I've got a few ideas. Why don't you share what you think are key examples of how different groups, different tribes actually come together? While they appear as opposing or conflicted, there's overlap.
All right, so we've got two distinct tribes on the surface. There's 11 total. On one hand, we have the adventurists, the constant pursuit for knowledge, to explore, to live the new, to enjoy each day, a certain amount of hedonism there. They tilt a little younger, but not entirely. No, in fact, maybe only slightly more, or under 45 years of age than over 45 years of age. By the same token, we also have what we've called the land of the free. Those are the don't tread on me, the big state, the belief in liberty. I have my right, my constitutional rights. They live by those. Freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, and don't encroach on my rights. They tilt pretty conservative. Adventurists tilt pretty liberal, and yet they both care deeply about the food that they eat. Neither of them favors genetically modified organisms. They both care deeply about their personal rights. One wants the freedom to hunt. The other wants the freedom to pursue knowledge. They both care deeply about sports. Both groups enjoy the fun of sports. Both groups overwhelmingly would allow their sons to play football. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, except that if you took a look at them on the surface, what you would say is, how does one group relate to the other group? And we found how they can relate to each other. This example is almost cliche. There is a group, not huge, but substantial, the happy hedonists. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow I die. They're Epicurean in many ways. They seek fun. Less in the pursuit of knowledge, more in the pursuit of fun. Almost to some degree, well, the land of the free are libertarian, the happy hedonists are libertine. Don't tie me down with old morals. On the flip side of that, there's the God Squad. And the God Squad are very conservative and traditional in every way, defined by their faith. And yet both of those groups, to a large degree, care deeply about the environment, about climate change. One will say, I'm worried about man's stewardship of God's earth. The other will say, I'm worried about the future of this planet. To say that these groups are diverse and divergent doesn't even begin to say enough. We know every possible means of keeping these two groups apart. And yet there's an antidote to that can bring them together, even temporarily, on an issue. And so it comes down to being able to recognize people who they are on the basis of how people define themselves who they are, not my preconceived notion or yours. We didn't go about developing these tribes by thinking up categories and saying, all right, now let's test these categories. We went right to people pure with open-ended questions and started a process from the bottom up of defining who they are. And as I said, what we've discovered is that when you put people in situations, you will have, number one, a sense from people that what drives them to make decisions is less to do with their race and their demographics, more to do with what their values and aspirations are. And that number two, there are commonalities out there, and that's where we have to focus.
Exactly. What do we shed light on? Do we hyper focus on the differences, or do we find the commonalities and drive those home? And it's just such a wonderful model because it has so many applications. We've talked about values, we've talked about consumer habits, and even political ideologies falls in there too. You know, one thing that comes to mind, and to my knowledge, nobody has successfully embarked on this path, at least in a long time. I can't think of anything now, but if you take Bernie Sanders and Trump, right? Completely different philosophies and viewpoints of the world. You have a section or a group within Trump supporters that, you know, like you talked about the land of the free, have a lot of libertarian sentiment. You look at Bernie Sanders and the unifying theme behind it all is progressive, but in that is anti-war, the environment. Well, I think people have forgotten that libertarians and progressives have a lot of crossover.
Yeah, they do. Yes, they do.
I mean, just within 10 years ago, the quintessential progressive and the quintessential libertarian got together, and it was barely talked about in the media. Ralph Nader, the quintessential progressive, and Ron Paul, the quintessential libertarian, came together on TV. I think I saw this on CNBC, and it seemed to be covered for like one day. And they agreed on three things. They agreed on bring all the troops home, give back our rights to privacy, end the Patriot Act, end the surveillance state, and audit the Federal Reserve. So what is implicit in all of that is a populism, an anti-corporatist mentality, anti-war sentiment, and a desire for privacy. And who can build that coalition? It can be done. It's just people are too focused on division right now.
Yeah, and it's beyond counterproductive. I mean, in fact, let's just take it right to this very moment. Here we are approaching mid-December, and we have people whose unemployment is going to be gone in a couple of weeks. We have people who have lost their health care. We have small businesses that are shuttering at record speed. And yet, Congress still haggling over what amounts to be a Band-Aid, phase one of more relief. Somebody's got to do it. And yet the focus has been on the divisions in the bill as opposed to the immediate needs of the bill. Sadly, in principle, all three parts, the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress, the President and the White House, have agreed in principle, but they just can't seem to get that bill signed. Some of it has to do with ego, who's going to take credit and who isn't going to take credit. Some of it has to do with some members of Congress legitimately feeling that their district won't buy it. Therefore, they can't bend to what Washington says. They have to bend to what people in their district say. But whatever it is, it's counterproductive to problem solving. Somebody's got to work on working with the American people and finding those bridges. And that's where I think that we come in with tribal analytics. So we'll ask you to look at Forbes. In fact, those of you who are on our list and are watching this, we're sending out the latest piece for Forbes about tribal analytics. Yeah. You're writing another piece on tribal analytics.
Yeah, it's called The Bottom-Up Revolution, How to Heal the Divide and Forge Alliances. And maybe a lot of this content that I talked about in this podcast will springboard some more ideas, but I think it's absolutely essential. I'm going to say this is going to sound dire, but this may be our last ditch effort to come together.
It could be.
Everybody knows that habits are formed, and that the only way to overcome bad habits is through a conscious effort. And we are in a bad habit right now of dividing, drawing our lines, and saying, I can't talk to these people, I can't listen to these people. I can't tell you how many times you all are aware of this. You're hearing this too. You know what I'm talking about. I just can't talk with that person anymore. They're crazy. We're drifting apart, and we can focus on our differences, or we can make an effort to find common ground. The common ground is there. It is there in so many ways. I dedicated an issue in the intelligence here to finding common ground. Americans are ripe for finding common ground. If the darker forces of divisiveness continue to rally and seize the day, and from the top down, that will permeate throughout society and it will rip us apart. But the counter to that has to be from the bottom up, that we go actively seek common ground. It's there. And I think we're going to make that a major focus from here on.
I like that. I look forward to seeing your piece. So last week we ended interactively. We talked about who would be Time's Person of the Year, and also how would you grade President Trump. We heard a lot about President Trump, mainly negative. And then we got some votes, mainly Dr. Fauci's Person of the Year, healthcare workers Person of the Year. Someone told us COVID-19 as the entity of the year, because by definition for Time, whoever had the most impact. Well, as we know now, it was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And we don't need to talk about that now. I'd like to throw out another question. Jeremy and I are thinking of inviting guests to come in. We have some ideas, and we have some good friends. We'll reach out. Ralph Nader, you mentioned. I think we ought to reach out to Ron Paul as well. Dick Morris. Some people may have questions about Dick Morris, but he's one of the brightest people I know, a great strategist. Why don't you tell us out there who you'd like to see or hear from as one of our guests, and we'll do the best that we can to invite them to come on our podcast here.
Leave it in the comments on YouTube You leave it in the comments on whether you listen to our podcast through SoundCloud or Spotify or Stitcher. Leave the comments, or if you want to write to me, Jeremy at johnzogbystrategies.com, John at johnzogbystrategies.com, or go to the website, but give us a list. We want to hear from you.
That's a wrap. Okay, week 49. Thank you. We took on a very difficult issue, but we're working on providing a solution. That's what we're all about. Thanks. Have a good week.
Take care.